The transport vessel descended through the upper atmosphere with a soundless shudder, its hull reinforced against the brutal turbulence of the death world below. Inside the cabin, cadets from 14 different alien races sat strapped into their harnesses, most of them in tense silence. The Deathworld Practicum was infamous across the Galactic Academy. Records showed that in every class that had attempted it, 9 out of 10 cadets had failed. Some collapsed from exhaustion, others from hunger, still others from sheer panic at the hostile environment. For many species, surviving even a single rotation on this planet was a near impossible task. Yet here they were, a new cohort, thrown into the crucible to prove themselves. The human sat among them, his posture unusually relaxed for someone about to be dropped into the most dangerous ecosystem charted within the sector. He leaned back against the harness straps, his eyes half closed, as if the violent shaking of the descent lulled him into a sort of half-sleep. Around him, crystalline cadets hummed at nervous frequencies, avian cadets pulled their wings tight to their sides, and reptilian cadets clicked their claws against their restraints. The instructors had not spoken much before launch. The mission briefing was brutally simple: survive until retrieval. No drones, no automated supplies, no continuous monitoring except for a life sign beacon each cadet carried. The instructors believed that only true instinct and adaptability could carry a cadet through the death world's merciless cycles. As the clamps engaged, the entire cabin jolted and the hatches began to open. A rush of hot, acrid wind poured inside, carrying with it the sharp stench of metallic dust and acidic spores. One by one, the cadets were pushed toward the hatch and ordered to jump. Some hesitated, trembling at the sight of the cracked surface below, glowing faintly as if the earth itself simmered with internal fire. The human stepped forward without pause, his movements steady, and leapt into the gale. He landed with a soft thud on the jagged terrain, bending his knees to absorb the impact. The ground was unstable, tiny fissures running like veins beneath the surface, shifting with every gust of wind. He stood still for a moment, adjusting his breathing, his gaze scanning the horizon. The sky above was a bruised mix of orange and gray, fractured by dark clouds that swirled with electric discharges. Twin suns blazed faintly through the storm, casting harsh shadows across the ridges. Around him, alien cadets scrambled to find footing, their equipment already faltering. A crystalline cadet let out a shrill cry as his energy shield flickered and collapsed under the abrasive wind. An insectoid cadet dropped his ration kit when his armored limbs sank into the brittle ground. Panic spread in ripples. The human did not panic. Instead, he reached for the small pack slung across his back, unfastened the straps, and calmly withdrew a folded cloth. It was not survival gear in the conventional sense, not a reinforced tent or a plasma shield. It was a simple blanket, durable but ordinary, and he spread it neatly across a flattish patch of rock near a cluster of weathered boulders. He sat down on it with the same deliberate calm as if he were preparing for a midday break in a quiet meadow, not the deadliest surface in the galaxy. He unpacked a small container of rations, dried meat, hard bread, and a flask of water, and arranged them on the cloth as if setting up a picnic. Around him, cadets shouted in alarm as an acidic drizzle began to fall, sizzling faintly when it struck exposed gear. One reptilian cadet shrieked when a droplet burned into his protective padding. The human did not rush for shelter. He observed the drizzle with a calculating gaze, then shifted the blanket slightly under the partial overhang of the boulders, where the stone naturally repelled most of the rainfall. He adjusted his seat, placed the food on his lap, and bit into the bread as though nothing around him warranted panic. Some cadets stared in disbelief. To them, the Deathworld Practicum was a fight for life, a desperate scramble against an environment designed to break body and mind. To him, it appeared to be a puzzle, a set of rhythms to study, an atmosphere to understand. His calm presence seemed out of place, almost infuriating to those who struggled. A crystalline cadet shouted in his direction, demanding to know if he was mad. The human simply chewed his bread, swallowed, and answered with a quiet voice that was nearly swallowed by the roar of the wind. First, sit. Watch. Learn. Then act. No one knew what to make of it. For the alien cadets, survival meant deploying every tool at once, building defenses immediately, scrambling to fight against the hostility of the terrain. For him, it meant stillness, patience, and observation. He kept eating, his eyes never leaving the shifting dunes of metallic sand, the erratic flashes of lightning in the distance, the way small reptilian creatures darted from crevices only when the drizzle thinned. He recorded these details in his mind with each bite of food. By the time the drizzle ended, several cadets had already lost vital equipment. Power cells were drained in an attempt to maintain shield bubbles, ration packs were spoiled by acid exposure, and shelters had collapsed under the weight of the storm. Yet the human remained seated on his blanket, food untouched by the rain, his pack dry beneath the stone overhang, his face calm as though the chaos were a mere distraction. In the eyes of the alien cadets, the human looked like a man out of place, someone who had mistaken the most infamous survival trial for a leisurely outing. But in reality, he was the only one who had already begun to map the hidden logic of the death world. He knew from the first moments that panic would kill faster than hunger, and that patience was as powerful a weapon as fire. When night fell and the first shrieks of unseen predators echoed across the landscape, the cadets who had scattered in fear huddled together in confusion, drained and disoriented. The human, however, adjusted his blanket, leaned against the stone, and closed his eyes briefly, resting as though this was merely the end of a long day. The practicum had begun, and he had already set himself apart, not with gear, not with strength, but with the unshakable calm of someone who treated survival not as war, but as rhythm. The night did not grant mercy. As the twin suns dipped below the ridges and the air cooled, the ground itself began to shift. Cracks widened, releasing faint plumes of toxic vapor that crawled low across the terrain. A crystalline cadet stumbled near one of those fissures, and the vapor etched fractures across his translucent limbs until he collapsed. His companions tried to pull him back, but their protective gear was too fragile to withstand more than a few breaths of the fumes. By dawn, only his beacon flickered dimly, signaling failure to the monitoring ship above. The others scattered further apart, each group convinced that distance from the strange human meant better odds of survival. The human rose from his seat when the first faint light painted the horizon. He had slept for only a few hours, his back pressed against stone, his blanket folded neatly beneath him. He dusted off a thin layer of metallic grit that had settled over the cloth and stretched his arms in silence. Around him, the land looked like the aftermath of a forgotten war. Shelters half melted, equipment discarded, footprints scattered in circles of panic. He moved through the area with unhurried steps, observing more than touching. He knelt beside a collapsed shield generator, pressed 2 fingers against its casing, and withdrew quickly when the metal burned his skin. The residue was corrosive, eating away at alloys that should have been nearly indestructible. He understood then that reliance on technology was doomed here. The cadets who had clung to drones and shield bubbles would only bleed themselves into exhaustion. From the ridge beyond, a scream cut through the thick air. He looked up and saw an insectoid cadet thrashing wildly, his legs tangled in brittle vegetation that tightened with movement. 2 companions tried to cut the stalks with plasma blades, but each strike only split the vines into more twisting tendrils that lashed at exposed armor. The human did not rush to intervene. Instead, he crouched, watching the pattern. The vines struck at sudden movements, reacting faster to energy surges from weapons than to still flesh. He picked up a loose stone, waited until one tendril rose high, and threw the rock at its base. The impact distracted the cluster just long enough for the insectoid cadet to freeze. With stillness, the plant loosened its grip and retracted slightly, as though disinterested in prey that no longer fought. The cadet pulled free and stumbled back, his limbs trembling. His companions glared at the human across the ridge, unsure whether to consider him a savior or a predator who had exposed their weakness. He did not speak to them. He returned to his blanket, folded it, and packed it into his kit. He carried no weapons beyond a simple knife and no tools beyond the basics, yet his composure weighed heavier than the armor of any alien soldier. By midday, the sun was merciless. Heat shimmered across the terrain, melting thin crusts of rock into bubbling puddles that spat toxic steam. Cadets wandered in disarray, their reserves already depleted. An avian cadet collapsed onto the ground, wings outstretched, his breath shallow and irregular. His companion, a scaled reptilian, tried to lift him but fell backward under the sudden weight. The human approached with measured steps, crouched beside the fallen cadet, and shaded his face with the cloth he carried. He poured a trickle of water from his flask onto the cloth, pressed it against the avian's brow, and signaled to the reptilian to fan the wings gently. The simple act lowered the cadet's temperature enough for his breathing to stabilize. The reptilian cadet looked at the human with a mixture of suspicion and gratitude, unsure why this strange man seemed more prepared than any instructor's manual had ever suggested. The human said nothing. He simply continued his work, adjusting the cloth, rationing each drop of water carefully. When the avian cadet finally stirred, his eyes unfocused but alive, the human returned to his seat, unwrapped a portion of dried food, and ate in silence. That afternoon, the first full collapse occurred. A group of crystalline cadets had gathered near a depression that looked like a safe basin. They built makeshift shelters there, believing the rocks would shield them from wind. The human had passed the same depression earlier in the day, paused, and marked a line on his journal without stepping closer. Now he watched from a higher ledge as the basin trembled, then sank with a deep groan. The ground liquefied, pulling the crystalline cadets into a pool of corrosive slurry that swallowed their structures in minutes. Their shrieks echoed long after their bodies dissolved. Those who survived above the basin fled in horror, scattering further apart. The human turned the page in his journal, drew a small sketch of the depression, and wrote a brief note. "Do not trust still ground." Evening descended once more, the second night promising worse trials than the first. Alien cadets who had once mocked him now glanced toward his position from a distance, unsettled by his ability to remain unharmed. He was not stronger, nor faster, nor equipped with superior technology. He simply refused to fight the death world in the way the Academy had trained others. When another acidic drizzle began to fall, he moved again under the same stone overhang, sat down, and unwrapped his blanket. In the distance, reptilian cadets tried to erect a shield dome, but their device fizzled, consumed by the rain. The panic in their voices carried far, piercing the constant hum of the storm. The human chewed another piece of hard bread, raised his eyes toward the dark horizon, and studied the lightning patterns. He knew by then that the storms followed a cycle, and he marked the intervals in his journal with deliberate strokes. He would not waste energy racing against the planet. He would learn its rhythm and let it teach him how to survive. As the storm deepened, the wails of failing equipment mixed with the cries of cadets who realized their efforts had only hastened their end. The human adjusted his position, rested his back against the rock, and closed his eyes once more. He was not sleeping, not entirely. His ears tracked every shift in the storm, every pause between strikes, every silence that hinted at danger lurking beneath. The death world was not an enemy to conquer, he understood. It was a teacher. Those who refused to listen would collapse. Those who listened might endure. The storm passed with the same suddenness as it had arrived, leaving the ground slick with acidic residue and the air heavy with an acrid tang that clung to the throat. The alien cadets who had managed to endure the night stumbled about in fractured groups, their faces marked with exhaustion and disbelief. Some had no more than a ration pouch left, Others carried fragments of ruined gear, and many bore burns or lacerations from their desperate attempts to resist an environment that seemed designed to punish resistance itself. The human emerged from his shelter with quiet composure. His blanket was neatly folded and dry, his pack intact, and his expression steady. He did not appear untouched. His skin bore faint welts from the sting of the acidic drizzle, and his eyes showed the same fatigue that weighed on everyone. But his demeanor carried no trace of panic. He scanned the horizon with calm curiosity, then knelt on a patch of stone that the storm had spared. From his pack, he drew out the same folded cloth, spread it across the rock, and placed upon it portions of food with deliberate care. The sight stunned those watching from a distance. At first, no one approached. Alien cadets whispered among themselves, pointing at the human who sat in the open, calmly eating as if the trial were nothing more than an outdoor excursion. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, but suspicion gnawed harder. To them, his behavior seemed unnatural, almost mocking, as though he were immune to the suffering that tormented everyone else. Yet the longer they watched, the more the scent of his food lured them forward. Dried meat crisped slightly in the heat, bread released a faint aroma, and water glistened as it poured from his flask. One by one, the weakest cadets began to edge closer, their movements hesitant, their bodies hunched with shame. The human did not call to them, nor did he push them away. He simply raised his eyes when each drew near, gestured for them to sit, and slid small portions of food across the cloth. A crystalline cadet, her limbs still faintly fractured from the night's ordeal, reached out with trembling fingers and accepted a piece of bread. An avian cadet lowered his head as he tore into dried meat, his sharp beak clacking in desperation. A scaled reptilian cadet, her armor scarred from the storm, drank cautiously from the flask before handing it back without a word. When the first hunger eased, the human began to speak. His voice was low but clear, measured like a teacher who expected his audience to listen. He explained that survival on this world did not depend on strength or the endurance of machines, but on rhythm and restraint. He pointed to the sun overhead and traced its path with his finger, marking the interval before the next storm. He told them that eating cold conserved energy, that sleeping in short intervals kept the body aligned with the planet's cycles, and that panic consumed more air and water than the body could afford to waste. His words at first seemed too simple to be profound, yet the cadets listened. Perhaps it was because his tone carried no arrogance, only certainty born of observation. He broke off another piece of bread, placed it on the cloth before him, and explained how rationing worked. Never eat to fullness, never drink until the flask is empty, never treat provisions as endless. A cadet asked in a halting voice why he did not hoard his food, why he gave it to strangers who would only compete with him later. He looked at her with calm eyes and answered that a starving ally was more dangerous than a hungry predator, and that shared food built loyalty stronger than shared fear. Silence followed, heavy with unspoken agreement. One by one, cadets nodded faintly, as though the truth of his words struck deeper than any instructor's manual had ever managed. When he finished his small lecture, he leaned back against the stone and allowed the cadets to sit in the shade beside him. He said nothing more for a time, only observed as they began to copy his actions. A crystalline cadet wrapped her remaining food in cloth, imitating his neat folds. An avian cadet practiced sipping water slowly instead of gulping it in one desperate motion. A reptilian cadet closed his eyes, attempting to slow his breath as the human had instructed. What had begun as an improvised picnic was transforming into a lesson. Others who had hesitated at a distance now moved closer. Hunger outweighed pride, and curiosity outweighed suspicion. The circle around the human grew until nearly a dozen cadets sat at various angles, listening with intense silence as he spoke in short bursts between bites of food. He showed them how to tilt their heads against the wind to avoid the sting of metallic dust, how to press cloth against their mouths when vapor rose from the fissures, and how to spot the faint shimmer of safe rock versus the unstable gleam of ground ready to collapse. His hands moved with precision as he demonstrated, his knife tapping stone here, scratching a line there, until each gesture imprinted itself into the cadets' minds. By the time the sun reached its peak, the atmosphere around the human no longer felt like chaos. It resembled a classroom. The cadets had begun to ask questions, timidly at first, then with urgency. Each answer he gave was practical, stripped of ornament, delivered with the same calm as his breathing. He did not claim authority, yet authority formed around him nonetheless. When the next drizzle threatened from the horizon, several cadets moved quickly to gather stones for an overhang, copying the way he had chosen his shelter before. When the wind rose, others wrapped their food and packed their gear in the same deliberate folds he had shown. For the first time since the trial began, the panic lessened. The cadets looked not at the storm with terror, but at him with expectation, waiting for the next piece of guidance. He did not disappoint them. He told them that survival was not a matter of outlasting the planet, but of joining its rhythm. He lifted a finger to the sky, counting the intervals between lightning flashes, and marked the silence that followed. He explained that predators would emerge not in chaos, but in predictable cycles, and that those who listened would be prepared. His voice was steady, his tone devoid of triumph. He was not boasting of human resilience, nor mocking their fear. He was simply teaching. By dusk, the cadets who had once scattered in distrust were now gathered in a loose circle, their bodies closer together, their breathing calmer. They had food in their stomachs, water in measured portions, and knowledge that felt more valuable than any shield generator or ration kit. The human folded the cloth once more, packed his few possessions, and rested against the stone with his arms crossed. The cadets settled beside him, their eyes still wary but no longer desperate. The picnic had ended, but the lesson lingered, etched deeper than hunger or exhaustion could erase. For the first time, the death world seemed survivable, not because it had grown less hostile, but because someone had shown them how to endure it with calm, patience, and method. As the sun sank once again and shadows stretched across the scarred terrain, the human closed his eyes and allowed himself a rare smile. The trial was still far from over, but he had proven one thing already. Survival could be taught, even here. The fourth day began with an uneasy stillness. The sky hung low, pale and bruised, as if the world itself held its breath before deciding what new cruelty to unleash. The cadets who had chosen to remain near the human awoke in a slow ripple, stretching sore limbs and checking what few possessions they still had. Hunger lingered in their stomachs, but it no longer consumed their minds. Exhaustion weighed on their bodies, but it no longer dictated their actions. They looked to him, not as a savior, but as someone who understood how to walk in rhythm with this hostile land. He rose early, his movements deliberate but unhurried, his blanket folded neatly into his pack, his knife secured at his belt, and his small journal tucked beneath his arm. He studied the horizon before the suns rose fully, noting how the shadows clung to the edges of distant ridges. He explained that the wind would shift once the suns reached a certain height, and that the shift would reveal a safer path across the cracked ground. The cadets listened without protest. They had learned that his observations were never guesses. Every word he spoke carried the weight of patient study. When the wind did change, just as he had predicted, the group followed his gesture and moved in formation. It was not a march of soldiers, nor a scramble of panicked individuals. It resembled the slow and steady migration of survivors who had accepted that speed meant death. Each step was measured, each pause deliberate. The human walked at the front, scanning the ground with his eyes and marking dangerous fissures with small stones. Behind him, a crystalline cadet took note of his markers, etching them into a shard she carried as a crude map. An avian cadet circled above for brief intervals, scanning the distance and landing when the air currents grew unstable. A reptilian cadet carried additional weight for those too weak, his scales scorched, but his spirit steadied by the rhythm of the group. By midday, the group had reached a cluster of jagged rocks that jutted from the plain like broken teeth. The human inspected the formation, tapping the stone with his knife, listening for hollow resonance. He found a crevice that led to a shallow cavern shielded from the sky. He signaled for the cadets to enter, guiding them one by one into the shade. Once inside, he knelt and pressed his hand against the stone floor, feeling the faint vibration of something moving beneath. He told the others to stay still and listen. At first, the cadets heard nothing. Then a subtle scraping sound rose from below, like claws raking against stone. An insect-like predator emerged from a crack near the wall, its mandibles clacking in anticipation of easy prey. Panic stirred, but the human raised his hand for silence. He motioned for everyone to remain still. The predator advanced a few steps, its antennae twitching as it searched for movement. The cadets froze, their breathing shallow, their hearts pounding so loud that silence felt impossible. The human shifted one stone with his foot, rolling it slowly away from the group. The predator turned toward the sound and struck, its mandibles crushing the rock into shards. When it realized the trick, it hissed and retreated back into the crack, vanishing into the depths below. The cadets exhaled collectively, the silence broken by relief. The human told them that predators on this world were not mindless killers, but opportunists. They hunted what revealed itself, what made noise, what wasted energy and fear. He explained that silence and patience were stronger weapons than blades. His words carried more weight than any demonstration of strength could have offered. That night, the group did not scatter. They sat together in the cavern, sharing small portions of food and water. The human continued his quiet lessons, showing them how to conserve warmth by lying close, how to rotate sleep so that someone always kept watch, and how to judge the interval between storms by the tremors in the ground. The cadets began to contribute as well. The avian cadet taught how to read shifts in wind that signaled approaching danger. The crystalline cadet showed how to reflect light from her shard to blind smaller predators. The reptilian cadet offered his knowledge of heat resistance, teaching others how to shield themselves against the worst of the suns. What had once been a fractured collection of individuals was becoming something new, a group with purpose, a group that functioned as more than the sum of its parts. The next day tested that unity. As they crossed a plain littered with fractured bones of some ancient creature, a sudden quake split the ground. One cadet slipped into the opening, his scream echoing across the rocks. Without hesitation, the human tied his blanket into a crude rope, anchored it around a boulder, and lowered himself into the crevice. The others held the line, their claws, wings, and crystalline limbs straining together. He reached the fallen cadet, lifted him with effort, and signaled for the group to pull. The cadets above worked in rhythm, heaving in unison until both emerged from the pit. The rescued cadet wept with relief, clutching his rescuer's arm with trembling hands. No words were spoken, but every glance exchanged in that moment carried a new understanding. Survival was no longer about endurance alone. It was about trust. From then on, the cadets began to move as a unit. When the wind rose, they huddled together. When the heat grew unbearable, they took turns shading one another with scraps of cloth or shards of crystal. When food dwindled, they shared what little remained without argument. The human did not demand leadership, but leadership grew around him like a structure that required no declaration. Each cadet knew instinctively that without his calm, without his rhythm, the group would crumble. As the fifth night fell, the cavern echoed with quiet voices, cadets recounting their days with an ease that had not existed before. Fear still lingered, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into vigilance, into a sharpened sense of survival, honed by unity. The human rested against the wall, his journal open on his lap, the flickering glow of bioluminescent insects casting faint light over the page. He wrote notes in careful lines, recording not only his observations of the death world, but the progress of the cadets themselves. He smiled faintly as he listened to their voices, knowing that the tide of this trial had shifted. It was no longer the death world against a scattered group of cadets. It was now the death world against a unit that had begun to learn, adapt, and endure together. And under his quiet guidance, that unit was no longer destined to collapse. The sixth sunrise came quietly, the first in days without a storm tearing the sky apart or tremors cracking the earth beneath their feet. The cadets rose from their rest in the cavern, their movements slow but not frantic, their eyes dulled by fatigue, yet brightened by something unfamiliar on this planet: confidence. The human stood at the entrance, his silhouette outlined by the pale light of dawn, his journal closed and tucked under his arm. He watched the horizon for a long time, noting the absence of lightning and the silence of predators. The planet was not calmer because it had grown merciful. It was calmer because the group had learned to live in step with it, no longer stumbling blindly into its fury. He knew the trial would soon reach its climax. The Academy's schedule allowed only a set span before retrieval. The beacon of extraction was hidden until the final days, revealed as a test of whether cadets had endured long enough to deserve rescue. He could feel it in the rhythm of the world and in the weight of the cadets' eyes when they looked to him. They were no longer desperate, but they were waiting. Midday brought the signal. A flash of blue fire tore across the sky, visible even through the swirling haze. The crystalline cadet raised her shard, catching the reflection and pointing toward the distant ridge where the light seemed strongest. The avian cadet confirmed it with a sharp cry, wings spreading as he lifted briefly into the air and circled back down. The beacon had ignited. The time had come. The human did not rush them. He gathered the group, drew a line in the dust, and explained the path in careful detail. The storms were due to return by evening, and the ground between them and the beacon was riddled with hidden fissures. He instructed the reptilian cadet to lead the middle ranks, the crystalline cadet to mark the safer stones, and the avian cadet to fly only in intervals, never long enough to drain his strength. He himself would walk at the front, not as a commander demanding obedience, but as a guide who had already proven the worth of his direction. The journey was long and cruel. The sun bore down with punishing heat, searing armor and flesh alike. The cadets faltered, but they no longer scattered. When one stumbled, another reached for him. When thirst burned through their throats, they passed the flask in careful turns, no one drinking more than the others. Predators circled, drawn by the rhythm of the march, but the group met them not with chaos, but with silence. The human raised his hand when shadows darted too close, and all froze in perfect stillness until the predators lost interest and slipped back into the cracks. Step by step, ridge by ridge, the beacon drew nearer. By the time dusk fell and the storm gathered on the horizon, the group had reached the final stretch of ground, a wide plain littered with fractured stones and unstable dust. Lightning began to crackle at the edges of the sky, the storm racing toward them with merciless speed. Panic threatened to return, but the human's voice cut through the air. He told them to breathe as one, to move as one, to trust the rhythm they had built together. He stepped first onto the plain, choosing his path with slow precision, and the others followed. The storm roared, but the group advanced like a single body. Every flash of light revealed their silhouettes striding forward, heads bowed against the wind, limbs locked in unison. The beacon pulsed brighter, its glow a promise of survival. The storm struck just as they reached it. Acidic rain hissed against their armor, and the ground shuddered under the weight of thunder. The cadets huddled close around the beacon, shielding one another as the human pressed his hand against its core. A surge of energy enveloped the group, and in an instant, the world around them dissolved into white light. When their vision cleared, they stood once more inside the transport vessel. The air was clean, the floor solid, and the roar of the death world replaced by the hum of stable engines. Instructors lined the walls, their faces unreadable as they studied the exhausted cadets. Some instructors expected collapse, others expected anger, but what they saw instead silenced them. The cadets stood together in formation, not scattered, not broken, but bound by a quiet unity that none of the Academy's records had ever described. The crystalline cadet held her shard against her chest, as if it were a sacred relic. The avian cadet rested his wings against his sides, but stood tall. The reptilian cadet supported a smaller comrade on his shoulder without complaint. Each looked toward the human, not for instruction, but out of acknowledgement. He had not only endured, he had taught them how to endure. One instructor stepped forward, his voice sharp with disbelief as he demanded to know how such a fractured class had returned intact. The human answered simply, his tone calm, his words stripped of any flourish. He said survival was not about resisting harder, but about learning the rhythm of the world and teaching it to one another. He explained that fear scattered individuals, but shared food, shared silence, and shared patience forged something stronger than fear. His answer left the hall quiet. No one applauded, no one cheered, but the silence carried more weight than noise ever could. In the days that followed, reports of the trial spread through the Academy. Cadets who had once been considered rivals now trained together, repeating the lessons they had learned. Instructors who had once preached domination over environment revised their teachings to include patience, restraint, and unity. The practicum itself was rewritten, its reputation forever marked by the group that had defied its 90% failure rate. Yet the human did not bask in recognition. He returned to his quiet habits, his journal filling with observations, his posture relaxed as always. When questioned about his calm, he answered with the same steady tone. Survival was not about glory, but about rhythm, and once rhythm was found, even a death world could be endured. The cadets who had once feared him now carried fragments of his lessons in their own words. A crystalline cadet taught others how to listen for echoes in stone. An avian cadet demonstrated how to read winds as signs. A reptilian cadet explained that strength meant little if it was not shared. Each credited the human, but he deflected the praise with a faint smile, reminding them that knowledge only mattered if it was passed forward. When the next class prepared for the practicum, whispers ran through the halls. Some spoke of failure rates and doom. Others spoke of a human who had walked into the death world with nothing more than a blanket, a journal, and a steady voice, and who had returned with a group united where others had fallen divided. For those cadets, the story was no longer about one human's survival. It was about the lesson he left behind, that the greatest strength was not in machines or instincts, but in the ability to remain calm, to observe, and to teach others how to endure. The human closed his journal one evening, the last page filled, and placed it carefully in his pack. He did not look toward the horizon with longing for recognition, nor did he cling to the past trial. He simply rested, his eyes closing as if the world itself hummed in rhythm with his breath. The death world had tested him, the Academy had measured him, and both had learned the same truth. Survival was not an act of defiance, but an act of understanding. The trial had ended, but the lesson remained.